Hi everyone, my name is Samaya and I'm an immigration attorney. Thank you for joining me on today's live discussion regarding choosing the best employment visa and how do you make that decision. So, as many of you know, or may not know, there are various types of employment visas that are available. Some of them are temporary visas and some of them lead to green cards. Sometimes a person is only eligible for one type of visa, and in other situations, they may be eligible for more than one. And so when you're in these kind of situations, especially when you're eligible for more than one, how do you pick what the best employment visa is for you? So let's go and do a bit of a recap on the different types of employment visas. And then I will go into a discussion of various considerations for you to think about in making your decision in terms of what visa you'd like to pursue. There are two types of employment visas. Well, you have the temporary visitor visa, right? So before we go into temporary work visas and work visas that lead to a green card, let's talk about the B1, B2, in particular B2. So most people don't know this, but when you're here in the United States on a B2 visa or a B1, B2, this is a visitor visa, you can engage in certain activities such as attending meetings, signing contracts, etc. You are allowed to do that. So that's great for people who need to be in the United States for a particular purpose. However, that does not authorize you to work in the United States. So keep in mind, just because you're here on a V2, it doesn't mean you can work. You can attend a training, you can attend a meeting, you can sign a contract, but that's kind of the extent of it. You can't, start working for someone for several months, working part-time for 20 hours or even definitely not full-time. So keep that in mind, because if you do, that will be a violation of your visa and it has certain immigration consequences. So now that we've talked about the options of a B2 visa or a B1, B2 regular visitor visas, let's go into actual work visas. So as I said, there are two categories. One is temporary work visas and the other is visas that lead to a green card. So temporary visas are non-immigrant visas that allow you to come to the United States to work. And after the visa ends, you have to leave. There are various temporary work visas with particular requirements for each, and also limitations in terms of how long you can stay beyond that visa, whether you're eligible for other kinds of visas at the same time. And we'll go over a list of these. So what are some temporary employment visas? Some of these you may be familiar with. Some may be it may be the first time you're hearing about them. So these include a H-1B visa. This is a non-immigrant visa, and it's based on a lottery system that employers can participate in to hire people who are going to do specialty jobs. So specialty jobs are ones that require bachelor's degree or equivalent, and generally these include, jobs in IT, finance, engineering, architecture, and more. It's a broad spectrum, but this is a temporary visa that many people are familiar with. There are limited visas available for H-1Bs. And there's specific time periods in which you have to apply for this. So to learn about each of these individual visas that I'm going to talk about in more detail, you can always visit our website at www.kaliklaw.com, or you can also sign up for our newsletter to get updates on these. So having told you about the H-1B visa option, let's discuss a couple other ones. Another one is the H-2B visa. So this is for jobs in the non-agricultural field for people who want to hire workers that are for jobs or positions that are temporary in nature or seasonal. This can include gardeners, caretakers, nannies, etc. It's a particular type of visa, and you have to be a member of a treaty country in order to be eligible for this visa. Another temporary work visa is the L1 visa. This is an option for people who have a U.S. office over here and a foreign office overseas, and they have an employee who they want to transfer over to the United States in either a manager capacity, executive capacity, or as a specialized knowledge employee. So that's a good option, and you can also pursue this visa if you have a foreign office overseas and you want to open a new office in the United States and transfer over an employee to aid you in developing that office. Another option is the O1 visa. This is a temporary work visa that is usually known as the artist visa, but it's not just for artists. It's for people who have extraordinary ability in their field. So this can include the arts, sciences, mathematics, education, athletics, etc. Sometimes you can even have a category that's not specifically there, including business, right? And an attorney can help you identify which area it falls into. But generally, you have to be extraordinary in your field, and it allows you to come here and work for an employer temporarily. And sometimes you can have multiple engagements lined up to get this visa. Another option is the E2 Treaty Investor Visa. For this visa, you have to invest into the United States by building a company or enterprise or investing in an existing business. There is no minimum amount. It depends on the kind of business that you're putting together. You will need a business plan, and generally you can renew this in 2-year increments indefinitely. However, this one is also country specific in the sense that some countries have shorter validity periods. So, there's a very short time period in which you can be in the United States and you can make an exit. So it's a bit more complicated. So depending on what country you're from, you want to see first if you are a member of a treaty country that you need to be a part of in order to be eligible for this visa, and 2, the validity period. But this is also another temporary visa option. Another option is a P1 visa. This is great for entertainers or people who want to come here to participate in some cultural event. It's somewhat similar to the O visa in the sense that, artists can utilize this along with athletes, but it's for a shorter time period, and it's very specific to athletes and entertainers. So these are the temporary work visas that are available to you. Some of the temporary work visas: H-1Bs, H-2Bs, L1s, O1s, E2s, P visas, and then there are a couple others that are specific to certain countries and industries. But generally, these are the ones that you're looking at, and they're temporary work visas. And temporary means that they're temporary, which means you only have these visas for a limited time. And for all of these visas, you need to have an employer, or for the E2, you need to create a business slightly different. But generally, for the majority of these, you need to have an employer. Now, let's talk about employment visas that lead to a green card. So these are EB1s. Who are EB1s for? EB1s are for people who have the highest skill and qualifications in education and in terms of experience in their industry. EB1 is for people with extraordinary ability, and these lead to a green card. So that's very, very important. EB1B is for foreign researchers or professors, and EB1Cs are for managers and executives. So this is kind of like the green card visa parallel to the L1 visa. That's important for you to remember. And keep in mind that these work visas, because they lead to green cards, it's a much higher burden and much more requirements that you have to meet. Another visa is the EV2 visa. This is for professionals with advanced degrees and people with exceptional ability, and for this you need a job offer. EB3s are for professionals with bachelor's degrees, for skilled workers, or for unskilled workers. And this also leads to a green card. So all the ones that I'm mentioning now, EB1, EB2, EB3, all of these lead to a green card. Then you also have EB4. This is for special immigrants. It includes people like religious or ordained ministers, other international employees that are stationed abroad, and there are some other specific groups. And finally, you have the EB5. So this is the $1 million investor visa that we're talking about, that a few limited people are eligible for, and which has substantial number of requirements that must be met. So to recap, these are all work visas that lead to a green card. As a result, these all have higher requirements that you must meet in order to get the green card. The bulk of them, you will need an employer to sponsor you. However, there are some where you don't need an employer, such as the EB1. If you have extraordinary ability, you can self-petition, or if the industry that you're in and the kind of job that you're going to do in the United States is of national importance, then you can get a waiver and not need to get an employer or go through a labor certification process called the PERM process that is very extensive and required for most of these visas that lead to a green card, work visas that lead to a green card. So having gone over the list of visas that are available, you can see that there are a lot of visas, right? Temporary visas and visas that lead to a green card. So sometimes it can be really, really difficult for someone who's eligible for more than one to make the decision of which one to pursue. My recommendation is, if you're in a position where you have an employer willing to sponsor you, meet with an immigration attorney to do an assessment. So they can look at your education qualifications, your work experience, the type of work you're going to be doing, how long, etc., the employer's background, and help you make a decision. Additionally, there are some other factors that you should consider. So what are the things that you should think about when trying to figure out what employment visa you should pursue? Well, one, is this going to be something temporary, or do you want something that's going to lead to a green card? Is the employer willing to petition for you for a temporary work visa, or are they willing to petition for you for a green card-based visa? The green card-based employment visas require a lot from an employer. A lot of them have requirements that the employer has to cover the fees. Additionally, they have to make other commitments. So you have to make sure that the employer is on board with that. Another thing for you to consider is processing times. How long is a certain visa going to take? The nice thing about employment visas for both temporary and the ones that lead to a green card is you can do premium processing, where you can expedite the time period it takes to get a decision, usually in 15 days, by paying additional fees. So while you do have that option, another thing for you to consider is, can you pay that additional fee? And some of these visas have a lot of additional fees besides the USCIS fee, including fraud detection fees, fraud prevention and detection fees. So that's something for you to think about. Fees, what the employer is willing to pay. Are they willing to pay for these visas? What they're willing to sponsor you for? Furthermore, are you already here in the United States, or are you outside of the United States? Depending on your status, if you're here on another visa, let's say a student visa, maybe you want to do a change of status to something that you can get very quickly, like let's say an O visa, as opposed to applying for H-1B, where it's a lottery. You don't know if you're going to get it, and you may have to wait around until March to participate in the process, and the employer wants you to start in like December, right? So that's something to think about. Also, if you're outside of the United States, then there's a different process that you have to follow. If you're outside of the United States, you're not going to have that option to expedite the green card part if you're doing one of the employment-based visas. So depending on whether you're inside the United States or outside, that's another factor that you want to consider. How quickly you need to start your job. Additionally, are you going to self-sponsor yourself, or do you need an employer? If you are in that part of your career where you're very, very qualified, and you have, like, let's say 10 years of experience. You don't necessarily need 10 years, but generally, let's say you have 10 years of experience, you're pretty distinguished. It's possible that you may be eligible for EB1 and you don't need an employer. Or maybe based on your qualifications, you're just kind of there, but not exactly there. In that case, maybe you have to get an employer and do the O1 for extraordinary ability. Additionally, do you plan on traveling outside of the United States? Let's say you're here on a visa and you're working for one employer, and let's say you want to transition to a E2 visa. A company wants to sponsor you for that. If you do a change of status, you're not going to be able to travel. When you leave, you still have to go to the consulate to get the visa. So that's another factor for you to think about. Can the visa you get allow you to travel in or out? What are the limitations? If you get the visa and you do it through a change of status, do you still have to get the visa stamp outside of the United States? Something else for you to think about. Also, can your spouse work on the visa or not? So there are some visas where your spouse can also work, and other visas where your spouse cannot work. For example, the O's, your spouse can come here and your children under the age of 21, but they can't work. Whereas for the L1, your spouse can work, or the E2s, the spouse can work. So that's another thing that you want to think about. What options will this visa or benefits provide to your dependents, your spouse and children? So having said that, as you can see, there are many, many considerations that you have to think about before making a decision, and an attorney can certainly help you to do that. So let's now I'll now discuss in more detail some of these considerations. An important one is duration of stay for different work visas. So for example, H-1B visa, you get that for an initial period of 3 years, and you can renew that for a maximum of 6 years. H-2Bs, these are very temporary in nature. One, they take a long time to get processed, right? So if the employer wants you to start in a month, that's probably not realistic. It takes much longer than that. Additionally, you can renew these in 1 year increments. Maybe you get this authorized for 6 months, right? Or to a year. And then you can renew for another year. But when you renew again, you have to, repeat a part of the process. And there's a maximum of 3 years that you can get this, after which you have to leave the United States and stay outside for 3 years before you can come back again on the same type of visa or another visa. So that's something to think about for that visa. L1 visas, you can get them initially for 3 years, and then you can extend them by 2 year increments. For managers and executives, you can get that for a maximum of 7 years. For those who are specialized knowledge employees, you get it for a maximum of 5 years. But also, if it's not an existing company and you're here to do a L1 visa for a new office, keep in mind, the initial process, you get it for 1 year, and then you have to renew. That's very, very important, and could be a factor in your decision. Another visa, the O. The O, you can get that up to 3 years, but you have to show that you have work lined up for 3 years. You can get that for a year, 2 years, but the max is 3 years. You can always renew as long as you're eligible, and you can renew again in 3 years, and there's no limit to this. You can continue doing this as long as you continue to meet the requirements, which is a great option. The E2 visa, as I mentioned earlier, there are different validity periods. So while you could continually renew, there are some countries that have a 3-month validity period. What does that mean? It means you have to leave the U.S., apply again for the visa, re-enter. And are you going to do that every 3 months? No, that doesn't really make sense. That's different than if you're from a country where you can get it for 2 years, or you get a maximum of 5 years. Different countries have different requirements. In that kind of situation, it makes sense for you to do it. You can keep entering and exiting, and you have a substantial amount of time. P1s are very, very limited. You can usually get them for, you get them for a year or however long the project, the performance or event is, and then you can extend them for 5 years. So it kind of depends on the type of visa that you have. how long you can stay. And the other thing is that some of these visas are dual intent and some are not. So let's talk about that. I didn't really mention that before. For temporary visas, some of them allow you to be here in the United States, and if you become eligible for some other type of visa that leads to a green card, there's no problem with you applying for that. But there are other visas like the E2 where they're not dual intent, which means that when you apply for that visa, you said that you're going to go home after the work or project was done. So there can be a bit of an issue with that, right? You have to demonstrate that you have the intent to go home. So you have to keep in mind if a visa is dual intent or not dual intent, and that you don't violate that. Okay, so these are various things that we talked about: duration, intent, etc. With the green card visas, of course, that's different. When you're applying for them, you're saying that you want to get a green card, you want to get permanent residence. So that's fine. There's no issue of that. After thinking about those things, then you want to think about your industry. What industry are you in? There are some visas that are better than other visas based on what you do. If you're an artist, it might make sense for you to do an O visa as opposed to a L1. You might satisfy the requirements in a much stronger way than you may for another type of visa. But let's say you're a manager or an executive, and you do have a company overseas and here, and you meet the requirements. It might be better for you to do that. But that doesn't mean that you're limited to just applying for that one visa. This is something else that's important. You can apply for more than one kind of visa if for some reason one doesn't get approved, as long as you're eligible for it. Another thing to think about is if you are going to do a job that requires particular education qualifications. So let's say you have a bachelor's degree or a master's degree. You might want to do the H-1B because that's definitely based on having particular education requirements. So think about the industry that you're in because that could also factor into the type of visa that you should pursue. Another thing for you to think about is, in the long run, what is the objective? A good case or example of this is, let's talk about H-2B visas. I often have people ask me about these visas, and these are generally for positions that are temporary in nature. These are non-agricultural positions, and usually people ask me in regards to nannies, but it can apply to other workers as well. And they're seasonal or for a short time. And the thing is, like, sometimes people want to sponsor for these kind of visas. They take a really long time to get approved. There are a lot of requirements. But then you have something called the E3 visa for skilled and unskilled workers, where you have to do a similar process, just slightly bit more, but that leads to a green card, and you don't have to continually renew it. So if you want that worker for the long run, it may make more sense for both the employer and the employee to pursue the green card option as opposed to the temporary one. So that's just an example of long-term what you want. Another example is, let's say you're extraordinary in your field and you're thinking about doing the O visa. There are some people who are really extraordinary. Usually a lot of people get the O visa and then they apply for the EB1, the parallel green card one. But some people don't need to do that. You can just go straight to the EB1. Maybe your portfolio is really amazing and you don't have to wait and you want that green card and you want to stay here. In that case, maybe you want to go straight away to the EB1. So think about long-term, what's the objective? This also means that sometimes you start off with a temporary work visa because you're not eligible for a green card based one, but that doesn't mean that while you're here on the temporary one, you can't make yourself more qualified for a particular employment visa in the future. Okay, so I think I covered a lot of important things for you to think about in figuring out what kind of visa you want to apply for in regards to a temporary work visa or a one that leads to a green card. Does anybody have any questions that they want to ask me regarding everything that I have discussed so far? Okay, so we have some questions that I've sort of addressed before, but I'll go over them again. Can I travel with an employment visa? Yes, you can travel with an employment visa. This is really, really important. And sometimes it's very necessary, right? Some jobs require you to leave the country, especially if you're here on an L1 visa, to go and work for the parent company overseas, come back, etc. Additionally, when you're here on a work visa, you don't want to be limited to staying in the United States. You want to be able to go travel for leisure or to visit your family, etc. So that is a possibility. Another question, is it possible to apply for a work visa while in the United States as a tourist? Yes, you can, but there are caveats. It depends. If you're here on, let's say, a visitor visa and you become eligible for a work visa, you can do a change of status, and you can, once you get that approved, you can stay here and you can start working depending on the type of visa that you have. Or it depends. You can get that. You might have to leave, like let's say you can start the process, but you may have to leave in a consular process before you can re-enter on the visa to start working. So the key thing is that while you're here on a tourist visa, you can start applying for an employment-based visa because it does take some time. If the visa isn't approved and you're almost up on your 6 months of the tourist visa, you do need to leave the United States. There are some exceptions to this, but it's a case-by-case basis, and you're welcome to contact me to discuss the particulars of that. Okay. Hello? How about now? Can you hear me now? Okay, perfect. So technology issues sometimes come up. Thank you for bearing with me while I figured this out. I have no idea what happened, but I'm glad you can hear me now. Let's see. What I was saying is answering the question about minimum salary. So there isn't a particular minimum salary that everybody who applies for employment visa needs to meet. Rather, there are prevailing wages based on the position and industry for green card based employment visas that you have to meet. So that kind of depends on the type of visa. Additionally, for some of these visas, the employer has to demonstrate that they have the ability to pay you what they would normally pay someone in that kind of position. So that's a way to think about it. And then for other types of visas, like let's say the O1 or even like the L1s, generally the salary should make sense for the position that the employer is hiring you for. For the O1s, especially if you're supposed to be extraordinary in your field, people who are extraordinary generally get paid very well, or they get other remuneration that demonstrates that they're very valued or they have really high skills. So that kind of just depends. Along the line, same thing with the investor visas. There isn't a minimum amount that you need to invest either. It really just depends on the industry, the type of business that you're creating. So it really just depends. And so that's why I would say, depending on your industry, the position, the employer, the numbers vary. It's not a set requirement that's the same for every type of visa and every individual. Okay, next question. Can I change while between work visas without leaving the country? Yes. As I said earlier, if you're here on a particular type of visa, you can do a change of status. However, there are certain visas where even if you do the change of status, which allows you to work, you may not be able to travel. E2 is a good example. So let's say you get a change of status from a H1B or an O to a E2. You get the status, yes, you can work, but once you leave the country, you need to apply again at the consulate to get that E2. O visas, let's say you change from a visitor to a O, you do a change of status, you can do that, or H1B to an O, you can change, but you still have to go to the consulate and get that stamp and that visa before you can re-enter. So travel plans come into play in regards to that. If you don't plan on leaving the United States, you can do a change of status and kind of just stay over here. But at some point, you're going to have to leave and go to the consulate to get that stamp and trigger that visa or activate that visa. Okay, perfect. What is premium processing? So premium processing is an amazing option that you have where you pay an additional fee. Depending on the type of visa that you have, it's a couple of additional $1,000. Let me see. Let me just see. Depending on the type of visa, it's a bit more for some over others. And this is a great option for people. So if you're going to do an OP visa, then it's an additional $2,500. If you're going to do a H-2B, it's an additional $1,500. And of course, for the green card based ones, it's $2,500. So in addition to the USCIS fees, if you pay this additional amount, you will get a decision in 15 days as opposed to waiting a couple of months. And the nice thing for that is, let's say the decision is a request for additional evidence. Even after you submit the evidence, you will get a final decision in 15 days. You can submit this at the beginning of your application, but you also have the option to submit this later. Let's say 2 months have gone by, you still don't have a decision, you can pay the additional fees to expedite the decision. Okay. If I am a student and want to obtain an employment visa, what should I do? If you're a student, then you need to find an employer who is willing to hire you and petition you for the process. A lot of times, students end up getting H-1Bs. Employers petition for them or engage in the registration process. And if the person gets selected, they will then be able to apply for H-1B. But if you don't get selected because it is a lottery process, then many times you will have to go leave the United States and wait for the employer to sponsor you for another type of visa. My recommendation for students is find an employer who is willing to sponsor you for H-1B, or, depending on your background, maybe you may be eligible for another type of visa. So do a temporary visa, build up your career, and then find another employer or the same employer who's impressed with you to sponsor you for a green card based visa. Okay. How long does a non-immigrant visa last? We kind of discussed this earlier. So it really just depends on the type of employment visa that you've applied for. Each of them have limited time periods, and they're limited because these are temporary, and that's different, of course, from the green card based one. The other thing to remember is if you're here on some of these employment visas, you can also become eligible for a green card in other ways in addition to a employment-based visa. Let's say you meet someone, a U.S. citizen or green card holder, and you marry them. They can petition for you. Or if there's another family member and you're eligible for another type of family petition, you can also pursue that as well. Some important considerations before I conclude for today is when you're on an employment visa, it's very, very important that you comply with the terms of your employment visa. For example, if you're here on an O visa and you had multiple employers on your itinerary and you got approved for all of those things, and let's say 8 months in or even a year and a half in, none of those engagements will continue and they've fallen through. If you have no other gigs lined up, no other events or performances or other work lined up, your employment ends. You have to leave the United States, even though there's still a remaining validity period on the visa. That's very, very important. The visa is good as long as you're working because it's tied to your employment. Let's say you do an O visa for a full-time employer and they no longer want to continue to work with you and you still have a validity period. You cannot keep hanging out here in the United States. You have to go. If you overstay on your visas, you can trigger the 3-year bar or the 10-year bar, meaning that depending on how long you overstay, let's say you become eligible for some other kind of visa and you need to leave the country and consulate process, you will be subject to a 3-year bar, cannot return to the U.S. for 3 years, or a 10-year bar, cannot return to the U.S. for 10 years. So it's very, very important that you consult with an attorney and you don't overstay or you don't violate other terms of your visa. Additionally, a lot of these visas are tied to an employer. If you change employers, you will either, depending on the type of visa you're on, you will need to amend the visa, or you'll need to have the employer do a whole new petition for you. So make sure when you're here, especially on a temporary work visa, that you're complying with the requirements. You know what you can do with that visa and what your benefits are and what your limitations are, just so that you meet all the requirements and that you don't do anything that will then prevent you from being eligible for something in the future. All right. Are there any other questions? Okay. I think I covered almost everything that I could think of for now. Of course, there may be other things that you have in mind or questions that come up later. We have an extensive blog on our website where I provided information on a variety of different work visas and different considerations that may be important to you. So I invite you to go to our website at www.khaliqlaw.com to review our blog. We also have a podcast if you prefer listening as opposed to reading. And we do have a monthly newsletter that we provide to all of our clients with updates and various information on a variety of different visas and other immigration-related news. So go to our website, subscribe to the newsletter, and as always, you can send us comments for future topics that you would like me to discuss. I hope this was helpful, and I hope that, especially for this type of visa, employment visas, do not apply for employment visa on your own. Consult with an immigration attorney. That's very, very important. So with that said, thank you for joining me on today's discussion, and I look forward to our next discussion and having you join me there. Take care and good night.